Old fisherman saves 1-month-old baby girl and shocking secret about billionaire family. It was the early hours of dawn, and a soft mist still clung to the surface of the Hudson River. Old fisherman Daniel, a thin, weathered man with tanned skin and calloused hands, quietly rowed his small wooden boat toward the middle of the river. His boat, no bigger than a single leaf drifting on the vast water, bobbed gently with the waves. The only sounds accompanying him were the rhythmic splash of his oars and the soft lapping of water against the hull in the morning haze. His life had always been tied to the river, to the endless casting of nets, the long days spent in silence, and the unpredictability of the waters, yet he had never once complained. That morning, however, the sky was a dull gray, and the river wind was unusually strong, carrying an eerie sense of unrest. As he cast his net, a strange sound cut through the quiet expanse, a faint, broken cry, barely audible over the waves. Daniel froze, his heart pounded. He had braved storms and floods, but never had he heard a sound like this in the middle of the river. Then, the cry came again, clearer this time, a desperate, fragile wail lost in the vastness of the water. Without hesitation, he turned his boat toward a sandbank where the current seemed to be pulling something in. There, drifting on the water, was a large wicker basket, half submerged, weighed down by the moisture seeping in. His hands trembled, though he wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the dread creeping into his bones. As he reached the basket and hoisted it onto the boat, a deep unease settled in his chest. Who would abandon something in the middle of the river like this? With shaking fingers, he unfastened the lid, his breath caught. Inside was a baby girl, no more than a month old, her tiny lips tinged blue, her delicate skin shivering beneath a thin, soaked silk cloth. Her eyes were barely open, her breath so weak that Daniel had to lean in close just to feel it. A sharp pain gripped his heart. How could anyone abandon a child like this? A helpless infant, left to the mercy of the freezing river? For a moment, he was no longer just an old fisherman. He was simply a man standing before a fragile life, a life desperately clinging on. Without a second thought, he ripped off his old coat, wrapped the baby tightly, and pressed her against his chest, hoping to transfer whatever warmth he could. His breath, hot against her cold forehead, mingled with the trembling of his rough hands as he gently rocked her. Afraid that if he let go, the wind would steal her away. The river wind howled around him, but all he could hear was the frantic beating of his heart and the faint, fragile cries of the baby girl. There was no time to hesitate. He gripped the oars, his muscles tensed, and rowed with all his might. He didn't know who she was, or why she had been left to drift in the icy waters. But one thing he knew for certain: he would never let this child go. That night, as the cold wind swept across the Hudson River, old Daniel sat inside his tattered shack, huddled by a flickering fire. In his arms, he held the tiny infant close, using whatever warmth he had left to keep her safe from the biting night air. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, nor whether he had the strength to care for this child. But deep inside, a small flame had been lit, one that cast a faint glow over the lonely, dark life of a fisherman lost in the vastness of the river. A few days later, Daniel started noticing something was off. People were staring more than usual, and most unsettling of all, a well-dressed man had been lingering around the docks, not just once, but for several days now. He didn't approach Daniel directly but had been asking around at the floating market, stirring up whispers among the vendors. Mrs. Harper, the woman who ran the soup stand, leaned in close and murmured, "Be careful, Daniel, those men aren't just passing through. I heard they're looking for a baby." Daniel simply nodded, but a heavy weight settled in his chest. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the corner of his shack, arms wrapped around his knees, watching the baby, Mai, sleep soundly. Under the dim glow of the oil lamp, her small face was so innocent, so peaceful, and yet, something inside him was screaming, "How much longer could I keep her safe?" Beyond the riverbank, the water lapped gently against the boats, as if whispering a warning. The tides of fate were shifting. A storm was coming. The next morning, as Daniel was pulling in his fishing nets, two unfamiliar men appeared at the dock. They were dressed in dark clothing, their sharp eyes scanning every corner of the pier. They didn't look like fishermen. One of them stepped forward, his voice low but authoritative. "Old man, have you seen anyone around here carrying a baby?" Daniel tightened his grip on the fishing net, keeping his face as neutral as possible. "This dock sees plenty of people come and go. How would I know?" The man narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing every word Daniel said. Then, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photograph. Holding it up for Daniel to see, his old heart clenched. It was Mai. But in the photograph, she wasn't the ragged little girl he knew. She was dressed in fine clothes, taken in a lavish mansion. A stark contrast to the humble shack they lived in. "Who are these people?" Daniel asked, feigning ignorance. He needed time to think. "We're looking for the daughter of a wealthy family. She was kidnapped 3 years ago." The man stared directly into Daniel's eyes, as if searching for the slightest flicker of recognition. "If you know anything, you'd better speak now. You don't want trouble knocking on your door." A cold shiver ran down Daniel's spine. These men weren't here out of goodwill. They never mentioned the police. Nor did they seem like people searching out of concern. No, their presence meant something far more sinister. Perhaps they weren't just looking for Mai. Perhaps they were the ones who abandoned her in the first place. Daniel took a deep breath and forced a scoff. "Rich folks and their problems. What's that got to do with an old fisherman like me? I scrape by day to day. I've got nothing for you." The men exchanged glances. Then, the one holding the photo gave a curt nod. "Fine, but if you remember anything, speak up. Don't make us come back too many times." They turned and left. But Daniel knew, this was far from over. His gaze shifted toward the little shack. Mai was still fast asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. He needed to act before it was too late. That night, Daniel packed a small bag, some dried food, a few of Mai's old clothes, and what little money he had saved. He knew these men weren't going to give up easily. Around midnight, he gently shook Mai awake, his voice low but urgent. "Mai, listen to me. We have to leave for a while. Okay?" Mai rubbed her sleepy eyes and looked up at him innocently. "Where are we going, Grandpa?" Daniel forced a small smile. "Just somewhere safer for now. This place isn't safe anymore." Mai, too young to understand, simply nodded and wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. She didn't care where they went. As long as she had him, she was safe. With that, Daniel lifted Mai into his arms and stepped into the night. He had no plan, no clear destination, but he knew one thing. He had to get her far away from this place. The two of them disappeared into the thick fog, leaving behind the cold, silent riverbank. By dawn, they had traveled along the winding river paths, avoiding the market and any place they might be seen. Daniel had only one place in mind. An old friend, Fuok, a fellow fisherman who had spent years drifting along the river. If anyone could help them hide, it was him. Just before dawn, Daniel reached a floating market along the river, where Fuok often docked his boat. When he spotted his old friend, he rowed toward him urgently, his voice tight with worry. "Fuok, I need your help. I need a place to stay. Just for a while." Fuok eyed him, then glanced at Mai, who clung to Daniel's chest. Suspicion flickered in his eyes. "What kind of trouble have you gotten yourself into now?" Daniel shook his head, lowering his voice. "It's not me. It's the girl. She's in danger." Fuok was silent for a moment before nodding. "Get on the boat, but you'd better tell me everything. I don't want to get caught up in something too big." Daniel let out a breath of relief and carried Mai aboard. He silently thanked the heavens. But he didn't know. Their enemies had already picked up the trail. The danger was far from over. Fuok hid them on his boat, larger and sturdier than Daniel's old fishing skiff. It had once carried Fuok across countless rivers. Now, it was a refuge. Daniel sat in the cabin, watching Mai sleep, exhausted from the long journey. Fuok poured him a cup of hot tea, his voice low and steady. "Daniel, you've never been one to get involved in messes like this. But this doesn't seem simple. Who were those men?" Daniel stared at his hands for a long moment before answering. And then, slowly, he told Fuok everything. The night he found Mai. The years he spent raising her. The men who came looking for her. Holding a photo that told him the truth. Mai wasn't just an abandoned child. She belonged to another world. Fuok listened carefully, then sighed. "Have you thought about giving her back?" The words cut through Daniel's chest like a knife. He had thought about it, but he could never accept it. Mai was his daughter. His only family. Before he could answer, a sound came from the riverbank. A small boat drifted closer. Fuok quickly pulled Daniel into the cabin and whispered, "Someone's looking. Stay here with the girl. I'll handle this." The oars stirred the water. Slow and deliberate. Then a deep voice called out, "Fuok, you had any unusual visitors lately?" Fuok stepped out, a casual smile on his lips. "Me? I don't see much besides fish and nets. Who'd bother coming to my boat?" There was a pause. Then the voice spoke again. Lower this time. "Just checking. If you see anyone, let us know. There's a lot of money on the table for the one who finds what we're looking for." The sound of oars dipped into the water again. The small boat drifted away, disappearing into the mist. Fuok turned back, his face dark with concern. "They won't give up, Daniel. They're not just looking for the girl. There's money on the table. And that means—" Daniel clenched his fists. He didn't care about money. All he wanted was for Mai to be safe. But deep down, he knew he couldn't keep her with him forever. Dawn broke over the river, painting the water in soft gold. But inside Daniel's heart, a storm was brewing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. They never stayed in one place too long. From river to river, always on the move, Daniel avoided the busy floating markets, avoided the crowds. But through it all, Mai remained as innocent as ever. At night, under a sky full of stars, she would giggle and ask, "Grandpa, where are we going today?" Daniel would stroke her hair and smile. "Somewhere beautiful, with fish in the water, with boats rocking gently. Wouldn't you like that?" And Mai would laugh, throwing her arms around his neck. She didn't care where they went, as long as he was with her. Anywhere felt like home. One evening, she gathered small stones by the shore, arranging them into the shape of a fish. "Grandpa, look, I made a fish. Does it look like the ones you catch?" Daniel chuckled, pulling her into his arms. In the golden light of sunset, their love burned bright, even in the shadows of their endless escape. But danger was never far behind. One day, as Daniel stopped by a quiet riverbank to fish, Mai played on the boat. And in a careless moment, she slipped. Her head struck the rocks. Blood. A sharp cry. Daniel's heart pounded as he scooped her up, running toward a small clinic nearby. He was too panicked to realize that the people searching for them were already close. The doctor cleaned Mai's wound. A nurse reached for her wrist, noticed the tiny gold bracelet glinting in the light. Her voice was hesitant. "Sir, this bracelet? Where did it come from?" Daniel stiffened. "It's just a keepsake." "Why?" The nurse said nothing. But moments later, police arrived. They weren't aggressive. They didn't need to be. They carried a file. Inside, a photograph of a baby. A face identical to Mai's. Minutes later, a sleek black car screeched to a stop outside the clinic. The door swung open. A woman stepped out, her eyes brimming with tears. She locked onto Mai immediately. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Bao Nok, my daughter." Then, she broke down, sobbing. The hospital fell into a tense silence. The woman trembled as she moved closer, her gaze never leaving Mai. Daniel reacted instantly. He pulled the child into his arms, holding her tight. His eyes swept the room, full of strangers, and in his heart, a terrible fear took root. Because any one of them could take away the only thing that mattered to him. The police officer stepped forward cautiously. An older officer knelt down, his voice calm and gentle. "Sir, we're not here to make things difficult for you. But Mai, or rather, Bao Nok, she is their lost daughter." Mai blinked, confused. She clung tightly to Daniel's sleeve. "Grandpa, who are these people? Why are they looking at me like that?" Daniel didn't answer. He only stroked her back, feeling her small, trembling breaths. 3 years. For 3 years, this child had become his own flesh and blood. The thought of losing her was unbearable. The woman sobbed. Her hands reached forward, hesitant, shaking. "My baby, I'm your mother. Bao Nok, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I lost you." But Mai only clung to Daniel tighter. "No, Grandpa, let's go back to our boat. I don't want to stay here." Daniel's heart shattered. She didn't understand. All she knew was that he was her home. He had rocked her to sleep on the river. He had taught her to laugh, to speak, to love the endless waves. How could he let her go now? The murmurs in the room grew louder. But Daniel only heard one thing. Mai's fragile voice, whispering through tears. "Don't leave me, Grandpa, please." He closed his eyes, and his entire body seemed to collapse. He had fought storms. He had outrun men who wished to take her away. But fate was the one thing he could not defy. Then, a man stepped forward, Mai's father, placing a steady hand on his wife's shoulder. He spoke in a low, steady voice. "We know you've cared for our daughter all these years. You are our family's greatest benefactor. Please, come with us. We don't want to take her away from you." The hospital fell silent. Daniel looked up slowly, his tired, old eyes filled with tears. He had never wanted wealth. He had never asked for anything. Only one thing: for Mai to be happy. But would she ever be as happy in that grand home as she was on the river? Mai was still clutching him, her small fingers digging into his sleeve. Tears streaked her cheeks. "Grandpa, let's go home." But now, where was home? The silence deepened. Daniel gazed at Mai. She was scared, holding onto him as if the moment he let go, she would be lost in this strange world forever. The old officer sighed. He took a step closer and said gently, "Mr. Din, you raised her with love. You gave her a home when she had none. But now, her real family has found her. Please, let her have the home she was meant to have." The sound of oars dipping into the water slowly faded as the small boat drifted farther down the river. Old Phuoc turned back, his face clouded with worry. "They won't give up, Old Din. They're not just looking for the girl. They're willing to pay for her." "I'm afraid that." Old Din clenched his fists. He didn't care about money. All he wanted was for Mai to be safe. But how much longer could he keep her by his side? Outside, the river was beginning to glow with the first light of dawn. But inside his heart, a storm was gathering. The days of running turned into long, tense months. Old Din never stayed in one place for too long, constantly moving from one riverside stop to another, always avoiding crowded markets and places where too many eyes might recognize them. Yet every night, when the world grew quiet, Mai remained as carefree as ever, as if no danger loomed over them. "Grandpa, where are we going today?" Old Din gently stroked her hair, his voice soft and warm. "To a better place, with fish, with water, where the boats glide peacefully. Wouldn't you like that?" Mai giggled and hugged his neck tightly. No matter where they went, as long as she was with Grandpa, anywhere felt like home. Some afternoons, Mai would gather small pebbles by the riverbank and arrange them into the shape of a fish. "Grandpa, look, I drew a fish. Does it look like the ones you catch?" Old Din chuckled, then pulled her into his arms. Under the golden glow of the sunset, their love for each other shone through, even in the midst of their endless escape. But danger was always lurking nearby. In the days that followed, Old Din moved in with Mai's family in their grand mansion. At first, he felt out of place, lost in the luxury he had never known. But every morning, Mai would come running, cheerfully grabbing his hand and leading him through the garden. "Grandpa, look, there are lotus flowers here, just like on our river." During meals, Mai stayed by his side, placing food on his plate just as he had once done for her. Little by little, Old Din adjusted to his new life, no longer feeling like an outsider. He no longer drifted along the river on his old boat. But every night, he still told Mai stories of the riverbanks, of the days they had spent together. And Mai, just like before, nestled close to him and whispered, "Grandpa, don't ever leave me again." Then, Mai's father stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Old Din's shoulder. With a sincere voice, he said, "Mr. Din, we can never thank you enough. You saved our daughter and loved her as your own. Please, consider this your home." Old Din looked around, his gaze resting on Mai's joyful face. Slowly, he nodded, taking her tiny hand in his. At last, he understood. Family isn't just about blood. It's about those who love, protect, and cherish you with all their heart. Outside, the sky was clear and blue, the golden sunlight warm and welcoming. It felt like the world was greeting him with open arms, ushering him into a new life where he would never be alone again. And so, Old Din and Mai's journey came to a beautiful end. This story reminds us that family is not just about shared blood, but about the love and sacrifice of those who truly care for us. How did this story make you feel? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, And subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories. Thank you for being with us.